in. I'm excited to see a full house. Welcome, and thank you for coming tonight. I just want to welcome you and say good evening, and thank you for coming to our Historical Society program. The program is in honor of Black History Month. We're going to learn about the Underground Railroad in central Massachusetts and the Blackstone River Valley with Professor Susan Franz. I'm Kathy Cavalieri. I'm president of the Westborough Historical Society. We're delighted you're here. And I would like to thank the Westborough Civic Club, who is sponsoring Professor Franz in this presentation. So thank you to the Civic Club. This is Tree Money at Work. I just want to say the Westborough Historical Society was founded in 1889 to preserve local history through research, programs, and the preservation of artifacts. Our headquarters is up the street at 13 Parkman Street. It's the Sibley House, an 1844 Greek revival home of the slaymaker, William Sibley. And in the house, we do have a museum that houses artifacts from the 1700s, 1800s, 1900s, and now we have a 21st century room. So we will be opening the house for Unplugs Week, which I believe is in April. So, and if you're a member and you contact us, we can arrange for tours, for private tours. For more than a century, the Society's mission has been to celebrate local history and bring that history to life through our monthly presentations, our tours of the Sibley House, and special events. If you enjoyed tonight's presentation, I'm sure you will, you can like our Facebook page, Westborough Historical Society. You can check out our website at www.westboroughhistory.org. You can become a member and join us through the website as well for a modest fee. You can come to some social events and be informed of all of our activities. Let's see, I do want to say that, give a little introduction to our presenter tonight. Susan Franz has a master's degree from Clark University and has taught at several local colleges. She played a key role in gaining National Park Service recognition for Underground Railroad locations in the Blackstone River Valley and designed an exhibit on the Underground Railroad. She teaches about the Underground Railroad and abolition periods at Assumption College's Worcester Institute for Senior Education, WISE. She resides in Uxbridge and has served on the Uxbridge Select Board and Finance Committee. And I'm pleased to introduce Professor Susan Franz.
Good evening, everyone. I'm so glad you're here. I'm glad the weather gave us a little bit of a break tonight, so it's not terrible out there. But thank you so much for coming. I'm going to do this a little bit differently. Instead of lecturing from the front, I'm going to move to the back and speak up, so I won't be blocking the view of anybody here. Frankly, if I've not done my job right, that should be more interesting than me. So let me walk back here. So welcome, everyone. So the Underground Railroad in Worcester and the Blackstone River Valley, that seems like an unusual topic. But it turns out this part of Massachusetts and New England was actually quite important to folks traveling from the slave states to Canada, and many who stopped here in New England and built lives here. So we are going to be talking about historical documents. Many of them will have language that we might not use today. I'm going to follow Frederick Douglas, who said truth is proper and beautiful at all times in all places, but there are some words we will not use here tonight. This is something that's called a Sankofa symbol. This comes from West Africa, and the symbol basically is interpreted to mean that you should treasure the past to build the future. And I'm going to show you where this symbol is located a little later in the presentation. So the Underground Railroad in New England. So a couple basics about the Underground Railroad. Despite the great movie and book, the Underground Railroad was not a railroad and it was not underground. So most people who traveled on the Underground Railroad did begin their journeys on their own. I'm going to read a little more than I used to because I had a wonderful person in a recent presentation who let me know that she had low vision and she wasn't getting as much out of slides as she wants. So please bear with me. I'm going to do that just a little bit. We know that free black families and formerly enslaved people often ran stations, that they operated as conductors. They were often in leadership positions, and in this part of the country, travel by ship was common. So the seaports were actually very important to the Underground Railroad. The way the railroad was built is we had communities that were connected together in many different ways. And this is an ad from the Liberator from 1845. The gentleman on the right is Charles Lennox Reman, who was an abolitionist. He was a free black from Salem, and he and his family, including about 5 of his sisters, ran a station on the Underground Railroad up in Salem. He was also the first black person to address the Massachusetts legislature. We'll talk a little bit about that. He addressed it when the railroads were integrated. But if you look carefully at the names of the towns that are in that little newspaper clip, we have Holliston, Uxbridge, Upton, Milford, Northborough, Southborough. These were abolition conferences, and they were all over the place here. And those abolition conferences are often pointers to where the Underground Railroad was operating, because we see where people were organized and interested. And if you look below that first set, there's another set of lectures by Frederick Douglas taking place at the same time in July of 1845. This is only about a month before Frederick Douglass went to England because his slaveholder was looking for him. So some of the seaports that we know are involved in the Underground Railroad include Cape Cod, Denison Sandwich, Wareham, Westport. New Bedford is a huge place on the Underground Railroad, very important. And then we see up through the Blackstone Valley, Fall River, Newport, Providence, Kingston, New London, Connecticut. All of these areas we know were active at this period of time. People would have often arrived either overland or on ships. Sometimes they would arrive in New York and then take a packet ship to New England. So these seaports were very important. And we can name particular people that we know where stations were operating. So one of the most well-known are actually Polly and Nathan Johnson. This was a free black family that lived in New Bedford, and that's actually where Frederick Douglass first found freedom in New England. So he and his wife lived with Polly and Nathan Johnson. So you can see these various people, some that we know like William Roch and William Roch Jr. were Quakers. And we'll talk a little bit about the Quaker influence in this area as well. So in Newport, there were stations at the Touro Synagogue, at the Isaac Rice House, George Downing House. There were stations in Kingston, Rhode Island, in Providence, and again, New Bedford had a very large and active community there. So the Thames River Basin, we have Brooklyn, Connecticut, Reverend Samuel May. I don't know if any of you guys are Ted Lasso fans. I can tell, yeah. So for those folks, Samuel May is here, is there, is everywhere. We will keep seeing this man. He pops up a lot. In Uxbridge, which was where I'm from, we had Lydia Buffum Allen Capron and her husband, Effingham Capron. And I want you to watch for the name Buffum. We're going to see that name a lot. That was a large Quaker family, and that large Quaker family managed multiple stations. We know at least 9 stations and 18 people from that one family who were involved. So Leicester, so Reverend Samuel May, he's also in Leicester just a little bit later, as are the Caprons. The Caprons will also move to Leicester and operate a station there. In the Blackstone Valley, we start at Fall River through Providence, and then we work up through Smithfield and North Smithfield, and then across the Massachusetts border into Uxbridge and Worcester. And then there was a second pathway that went to Taunton and North Attleboro and through that region. So you can kind of see with the yellow where these 2 pathways came up off the coast. And again, you see all the Buffums showing up here? So the Buffum family started with William Buffum, who was down in North Smithfield. His son was Arnold Buffum, and Arnold Buffum became the president of the American Anti-Slavery Society. Arnold Buffum had 5 daughters and a niece who were all involved in the Underground Railroad. So we see Buffums all over the place. And then you'll also see in Worcester somebody that you might be familiar with, who is Abby Kelley Foster, and her husband Stephen Foster. They did run a station on the Underground Railroad, as well as being some of the leading abolitionists at the time. So in New England, in the period that we're talking about, slavery had ended, but discrimination had not. And so from 1781, slavery was against the law in Massachusetts. We do know that some people who were enslaved were present in households up until about 1815. But prejudice was very, very visible in all of New England. So social and political distance between whites and non-whites was definitely enforced. Black students had very little access to education. Literacy was not illegal, but it was not well supported. For most children, black children, school would end at the end of primary school, and girls had trouble getting education at all. There were some high schools that boys could attend, but it was a fight to get high schools for girls at that time. So we see quite a gap in education going on in New England. Arts and public performances were segregated. So, you know, operas, we have notes of operas where people were pushed downstairs or removed from venues. We know that students with special needs, such as blind children, were barred from school. So the house school, which did exist at this time, that later became the Perkins School. And we'll talk a little bit about how that became integrated. Trade organizations were very slow to allow black tradesmen to be with them. Frederick Douglas had trained as a tradesman. He was a caulker, but when he came to New England, he worked as a laborer because the other caulkers would not work with him. So churches segregated their congregations. They would have what was called a Negro pew, usually in the back of the building. Abolitionists would try and sit on the Negro pool, and they would be thrown out of the church when that happened. Fraternal burial social organizations were segregated. Schools. We do see, even in some of the Quaker schools where black children were taught, that they were still being segregated to the back of the room, and that sitting next to a black child was used as a punishment. So we see these kind of things going on here in New England. Housing discrimination absolutely existed at this time. Robert Morris was a very prominent attorney at this time, and he also was unable to buy a home in a neighborhood of his choosing, a prominent black attorney. Transportation was strongly segregated, including the railways, cabins of ships, river boats. So when Frederick Douglass and Charles Reman, who traveled together, would travel on a boat, they would have to stay out on the deck no matter what the weather was. If they traveled on a carriage, they would have to sit on the top of the carriage. They were not allowed inside. So this is what life was like in New England at this time. Financial resources, banks and capital were segregated. And the military, we do see service from the earliest days of the colonies, but people were not, if they were people of color, were not allowed to be officers. And during peacetime, military options became very limited. So accommodations were often segregated. Whites often would not invite black friends to their homes or sit at the same table for during meals. And then, of course, the right to vote and policy making were very late to come. So enslavement began in New England very early. We're seeing it as early as 1638. And we see other kinds of slavery even prior to that. So Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Massachusetts had the largest enslaved populations. And we know down on the coast, down especially in Rhode Island, this is where the slave ships were coming from Africa and from the Caribbean. And we know South Kingston that 30% of their population were enslaved Africans. So we see all of this going on at that time. The earliest enslavement that we can document in the English communities actually is prior to the arrival of the Pilgrims. In 1605, we have Sir Ferdinand Gorges, who is doing fishing fleets and exploration up and down the New England coast. So he's eventually will have land in Maine and northern Massachusetts. He sends a ship and sponsors it. The captain invited 5 Abenaki men on board, and they were taken to England, kidnapped. Gorges was awarded the 5 men as compensation for his financial losses, so we're seeing chattel slavery beginning to develop from the earliest days. They would keep the men at Plymouth and then eventually send them back, but when they came back to America, the Spanish captured the ship on the return, and they were sold into the Spanish slave markets, so they didn't make it home. Gorges was involved in another incident. He brought over 29 Indians. The Spanish refused to buy them, and so he displayed them as curiosities in England. So by 1618, again, we're still 2 years before the Pilgrims, there's a record in London of a press of maidens to be sent to Bermuda and Virginia. So they were looking for girls and women. And they know they would just pick them up off the street and put them on ships. So the record says 40 have fled and their parents do not know what has become of them. 2 years later, we see the Pilgrims reaching Plymouth. And at the same year, we see the city of London saying that they had appointed 100 children from their superfluous multitude for transport to Virginia. After numerous deaths, they raised the minimum age to 14. So they were taking children just off the streets and throwing them on ships to America as labor. 1630, 10 years later, is when we see the Great Migration of the Puritans, especially around Salem. And then shortly after, we start to see the English Civil Wars. And so Cromwell, who you may have heard of, he will transport more than 50,000 Irish and Welsh people to Barbados in North America to clear out land in Wales and Ireland. So there's quite a lot of conflict going on in Europe, and that conflict is being reflected in the rise of the slave trade. So 1630s, the transatlantic slave traders become well established. Rhode Island begins to build rum refineries because rum was the primary medium that was traded in Africa for men, women, children. So that's how Rhode Island's economy was built on this rum trade that was going on down there. Again, we have the English Civil Wars going on in 1650. Scots who fought against Cromwell were enslaved, and many were sold to New England and Barbados. Quakers, religious persecution was also going on, and you could be enslaved for that. So in 1665, King Charles rounded up some Quakers who were hanging out in the jails and sent them over here. At the same time, the colonial government was also rounding up Quakers and sending them to England. So we see a lot going back and forth. 1718, we see the transport of prisoners to America begin. You notice it ends in 1776. That may be a familiar year. And it became kind of inconvenient to send English prisoners to America after that, so they began to send them to Australia. So the Saugus Iron Works had 400 Scotch soldiers who fought against Cromwell. And they were survivors of a death march. They were the survivors of a large death march where tens of thousands died. They were enslaved for a period of time, between 6 and 8 years, and they became workers at the Saugus Iron Works and other colonial businesses. We also see in the earliest records, Samuel Fuller was a Mayflower pilgrim. He arrived as a child on the Mayflower, but we do see in his will in 1684, if you note in the middle there, he says, "I give and bequeath to my son John Fuller the Indian Joel." And so we start to see people who are enslaved being passed down as property in wills and legal documents. This is Governor John Winthrop. He was deeply involved in the slave trade. He was an investor. He would buy shares in ships that were involved with this. And there are letters saying that he would want, so many people brought to his household, so many children brought to his household. And we also see in his will that to his son Adam, he gave him also my Indians there, my boat, and such household as there is. So the very earliest days of the colony, we're seeing this. These are names you may have some familiarity with. We talked about Samuel Fuller. William Pearson and Samuel Maverick they were kind of almost spies for the investors. They were sent over here to kind of keep an eye on how things were going. So there's quite a lot of correspondence that they created, which gives us a historical record. We talked about Governor Winthrop. His son, John Jr., became the governor of Connecticut, also heavily involved in the slave trade. And his son, Henry, went to Barbados and was running it from there. So it was kind of a family business for them. Peter Fannell, this is the builder of Fannell Hall, also involved in the slave trade. Stephen Hopkins was the governor of Rhode Island. He had a brother, Essex Hopkins, and Essex was in business with some people called James and Obadiah Brown. Those are the family that founded Brown University down in Rhode Island. It's the same family. So we do know that when the slave trade was made illegal, that fortunes were still being made. A lot of people were still running their ships. The sugar plantations, the rum were going on. The taxation without representation was focused largely at sugar and molasses. And it's important to understand this period that those were ingredients of commodities that were used in human trafficking at the time. So they were incredibly valuable. This is a trip that was taken. This is the Sally. And if you look at the bottom right-hand corner, you can see there's a signature. That's Essex Hopkins. He's the brother of Governor Stephen Hopkins. And this is the Brown family. This is the Nicholas Brown Company. And if you look carefully, it says that they're sending 17,000 gallons of rum to Africa for the slave trade. And on this ship, they brought back 196 people. There was a slave uprising on the ship on the way back. And between that and other things, 109 died on this particular trip. So as American history unfolds, we're getting now with the French and Indian Wars, the King Philip Wars, and we're seeing Native peoples fighting on both sides. It remained very common to kidnap and enslave Native peoples. In the Pequot War, we actually have a particular name which is related to this region. So there was a terrible massacre at a Pequot fort in 1637. John Mason attacked a fort where women and children were sleeping, and 400 people were burned to death. So only 10 of the people inside survived this, but we see these terrible things. The Eastern Pequot Tribal Council wrote in 2021 a letter that John Mason was the architect of a plan that would be a war crime today, and that he created a blueprint for genocide. One of the people that the Pequot were sheltering with was a family of a young girl named Anne Prask. And we know in the deeds of central Massachusetts that Anne Prask and her husband John Wampus, who was a Nipmuc, are actually on quite a lot of the deeds for towns. And these include Marlborough, Grafton, Sutton, Mendon, Oxford, and all the towns that descended from them. And because of Anne Prask, there's some research that was done by Professor Pulsifer at Brigham Young University on Anne Prask, and we know a little bit about her. So she was likely born in Albany, New York. Her mother died when she was a small child, and at the age of 5, she was sent to Eastern Connecticut to live with her father and his clan. Her mother was likely of the Sasquatch clan of the Paugussets. Her father was of a different clan of the Paugussets, and they were clans that sheltered Pequot War refugees. She was captured by the English during the Pequot War and sold to an ironmonger in Roxbury. So she ended up being part of a household in Roxbury. Joshua Hughes was a neighbor and was a teacher at the First Church in Roxbury, and it's believed that he was actually helpful in the first translation of the Bible into Algonquin languages, along with Eliot, who lived actually in the same community. So in 1660, Anne inherits huge amounts of land through her father, through Ramanuck. And she's also inherited land from her mother. So this includes much of Connecticut and much of central Massachusetts are now placed into her hands. In Native American tribes, not all of them, but many of them in this area, women could and often did own property, manage property, and could sell it. And we see that in those early deeds, where John Wampus and his wife are both mentioned. So John Wampus was a Nipmuc. He married Anne Prask, and they had one daughter who likely died young. He will, under English law, claim control of all of Anne's lands, and he begins selling. And it becomes a problem because his tribe apparently didn't know that he was selling. So he sold large tracts of land without consent of the tribe. The tribe took it to court. In Connecticut, there were hearings, and there's still some hearings based on that. In Massachusetts, they decided that these transactions were legal and that he could sell like that. 1676, John Wampus will go to sea and never sees him again. He shows up in debtor's prison in London. He's in prison in Cambridge and Boston. He's a fun guy.
Sure.
You know. And we know that she dies sometime before 1676. She's scalded and she will die of her rat wounds. She will leave her house to the Hughes family. The Hughes family is the family that was enslaving her. And so it's left to the children that she took care of when she herself was a girl. So the Connecticut courts were skeptical of John Wampus's land sales, but Massachusetts had little trouble with it. We know that there were 1,000 acres near Quinsigamon Pond, because he needed to get out of jail and pay a debt, and then he will die in London in 1679. So we have the unusual situation of actually knowing the names and transactions from when Native people's lands became English lands. So John Wampus's will would include 4 acres of land in Grafton. Those 4 acres are still with the Nipmucs today. So they have never changed hands, and they do have a powwow there every July. There have been court cases as recently as 2014 over these deeds in Connecticut. So around 1634, 1638, we begin to see the first part of the African slave trade. So there was a ship called Desire that was sent to the Caribbean with 15 Pequot boys and 2 women to go to Bermuda's slave market. And Indian children, especially children and young women, young men, could bring a lot of money in those markets, and they were used as currency. So they would send Indians to Bermuda and come back with Africans. So the Desire returned 7 months later, and this is the first known ship to carry enslaved Africans into New England. It didn't become legal until 1641, and in the 1670, the law changed again to legalize hereditary enslavement, but we know this was going on from the earliest days. We know that many colonists fulfilled their militia duties, so their war duties, by sending enslaved people and their households to go serve for them. We know that Connecticut blacks served in 25 militias during the French and Indian War, and that there were about 5,000 enslaved people and free blacks in Massachusetts by 1770. There was a report from John Jocelyn, and he stayed with Samuel Maverick in 1639. And there was a woman there who was crying, and he wrote, this is from the original record, she had been a queen in her own company, or her own country. Mr. Maverick was desirous to have a breed of Negroes, and therefore, seeing she would not yield by persuasions to company with a Negro young man he had in his house, he commanded him, willed she nildly, to go to bed to her, which was no sooner done, but she kicked him out again. This she took in high disdain beyond her slavery, and this was the cause of her grief. So we know this kind of chattel slavery was intended, and that it was operating from as early as 1639. So enslavement will end in 1781. This is when the Massachusetts Constitution is written, and there were enslaved people who went to court and put before the court that that should apply to them as well, and the courts agreed. So that's when slavery ended. But getting rights at that time, we did find that black people, black men at least, in Massachusetts could vote from pretty early days if they were wealthy, because there were financial tests, there were poll taxes. And also if they were literate. This is a literacy test box. This is from the Plainfield Historical Society. And this literacy test box basically could be rotated, and it would have 6 little cards in there with a paragraph from the Massachusetts Constitution. And before you could vote, you had to reach into the box, pull out a card, and you had to be able to read it. So again, this is one of the ways that voting was restricted as more people were becoming able to vote. So in these early days, again, we start to see a couple of things happening. In Sandwich, Cape Cod, we see one of our earliest Quaker communities developing. There is a Quaker community which has met there without break for 370 years. And they formed in Sandwich. Thomas Butler, Stephen Wing, Daniel Wing were part of this community down there. And the Butlers and Wings are ancestors of Abby Kelley Foster. This is where her family came from. And we will see their families, as persecution begins to rise on Cape Cod especially, they will move into the Blackstone Valley. So some of the offenses where punishments were given were possession of Quaker books and pamphlets, entertaining a Quaker at your house. Daniel Butler was whipped for helping a visiting Quaker escape. He was arrested by somebody named Marshall Barlow. You often don't see historians make a personal opinion, but Otis, who wrote about Marshall Barlow, said Marshall Barlow was a bad man. And I have seen nothing to disagree with Otis's assessment. Marshall Barlow was a bad man. So at that time, the marshals could keep half of anything that they collected. So if they collected a fine, half of it went into their pocket, which gave them very good incentives to go around and collect fines. And very few records were kept. There was a gentleman by the name of Humphrey Norton. He was banished from the colony. He then returned, sentenced to whipping, but he was not whipped because he declined to pay the marshal's fee for the privilege. I love Humphrey Norton. I think he's just wonderful. So they just banished him again. But yeah, Otis, who writes about Constable Marshall, he said there were 21 Sandwich households that he collected 129 cattle, 9 sheep, and 3 horses, tools, kitchenware, and food. So I think he died the loneliest man on Cape Cod, to be honest, after all of this. But there was a General Cudworth who was a colony leader, and he wrote a letter about this. He said, "It is sad, he that will not whip and lash and persecute and punish men that are different in matters of religion must not sustain any office in the Commonwealth. I told them, as I was no Quaker, so I would be no persecutor." They cannot put it out of their minds to see and hear poor families deprived of their comforts and brought into penury and want. Because remember, if they took your food and your animals, you couldn't run down to CVS and restock. You would have a very difficult winter after that. General Cudworth continued, our civil powers are so exercised in things appertaining to the kingdom of Christ in matters of religion and conscience that we have no time to effect anything that tends to the promotion of the civil weal or the prosperity of the place. But now we must have a state religion such as the powers of the world will allow, and no other. And this was going on as well in Salem. And in Salem, we run into a really interesting young lady named Provided Southwick. Provided Southwick and her family would become Quakers. They met the same missionaries who had come to Sandwich, and in Salem, they also found a lot of listeners. Interestingly, if you look at the left there, I've kind of highlighted two names. I've highlighted Provided Southwick, that's her birth record. And down below, there's someone named Elizabeth, daughter of Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters was the minister, and he's actually a fairly famous historical figure. It did not go well for him, though. So, just going to move on to here. So, Reverend Hugh Peters was a reverend in Salem. He went back to England when the English Civil War began and actually became an important person there. So he would go and inspire Cromwell's church to fight troops to fight against the king. And he would preach many sermons calling for the king's head, which is okay as long as everything's going your way. So Parliament would try the king, this is King Charles I, for treason. The military generals who are the judges are named Gough, Whaley, and Dixwell. They will eventually escape to Connecticut, and there's a intersection that has 3 streets down there, one called Gough, one called Whaley, and one called Dixwell. And that's the town where they were hiding out. 59 men would sign the death warrant. It didn't go well for them either. But King Charles was executed, and Reverend Hugh Peter was accused of being one of the 2 people involved in the killing of the king. So Hugh Peter stayed in England for a while. Cromwell was in charge for a while, and then the king's son came back to power, King Charles II. And Hugh Peter was still in England when this happened, and in 1661 he was executed in a very gruesome way. We know that he wrote a long letter to his daughter, the daughter Elizabeth, whose birth record we saw. That letter still exists. And when he was taken to the scaffold, by messenger, he sent a bent coin to her. Apparently that was the signal that they had agreed on to let him know when he was going to be executed. So there's quite a bit of record there, but he was connected to Salem from very early on. So the other person that we saw in that birth record, Provided Southwick, she was the daughter of Lawrence and Cassandra Southwick. And they were imprisoned for entertaining Friends missionaries. Cassandra had a paper in her home that was written by the Friends. She would be imprisoned for 7 weeks due to that. We know that several of their children were also imprisoned, and then we see a record that Daniel and Provided Southwick were to be sold to Bermuda for being Quakers. So they were to be sold into slavery and transported. That was tried to be executed. There was a clerk who tried to put them on a ship. The ships refused to take them. And so we see the family escape to Long Island, and then they will come back to Salem. And then Provided's family begins to appear 2 generations later in the Blackstone Valley in large numbers. And we see a lot of her descendants that become very important to the Underground Railroad. So there's these little connections into the deep history that come out to the Underground Railroad. So 1725, there's a will that her son Jonathan is to provide her support. She's in her 80s now, well into her 80s. And he will buy land in northern Rhode Island, Cumberland, and Salem. So we start to see a building Quaker community. And the reason they're in Rhode Island is that was outside of the Plymouth colony. That was beyond the borders, and so that they could have a little bit of protection. We have a record in a diary of Provided Gaskell's burial. So this is in 1727/8. And she was likely laid to rest in Salem in an unmarked grave. So her grandchildren will settle in the Cumberland region, and we see her descendants and other people from Salem coming to this region, largely for the same reasons, to get away from the persecution that was happening in Salem and the persecution that was happening on Cape Cod. So Gaskell's, Boyce, Brown, Buffum, Buxton, Chase, Foster, Nichols, Pope, Simmons, and Trask. And those are all names that are actually fairly common even now in the Blackstone Valley. So John Locke was a philosopher, and he wrote about the English Civil Wars. He was a young man when they occurred, and he wrote about it as an old man. And he seriously questioned whether it was possible to save another man's soul by setting him on fire. That was revolutionary at the time. That anybody would even think about that. And he said, civil interests I call life, liberty, health, and indolency of body, and the possession of outward things such as money, lands, houses, furniture, and the like. Now, the whole jurisdiction of the magistrate reaches only to these civil concernments. So, the government's interest is in the things of civil life, and neither that can it or ought in any manner to be extended to the salvation of souls. If any man err from the right, it is his own misfortune, and no injury to thee. Nor therefore art thou to punish him in the things of this life, because thou supposest he will be miserable in that which is to come. So that was revolutionary thinking at the time this was written. So his ideas were closely studied by the writers of the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson was a fan, and we see a lot of his thought, especially on freedom of conscience, being baked into the American founding documents. So this is where the Underground Railroad has developed in southern and central Massachusetts. You can see there's a southern route, there's a northern route. It was just houses and friends going from place to place. They would build these networks. Everybody was breaking the law, so it's a little hard to find some of the records. You have to look pretty hard. But they went from all the way from the south and up to Canada. The AME Church, Quaker Meeting House in New Bedford, House of Nathan and Mary Johnson, and the Lewis and Harriet Hayden Boarding House in Boston were busy stations. You see quite a lot of activity in those. We see organization through the Female Anti-Slavery Society. Salem's Female Anti-Slavery Society was integrated from its earliest days. It had black and white members. They would meet, they would raise money, they would write, interestingly, what they were up to, because women were not allowed to speak in public at that time. So really, the things that we know about them come from their written records. And boy, do New Englanders keep records. We have lots and lots of minutes. So they would raise money. We said, whereupon voted to send the sum of $10 to Mr. Williams. Voted to send the sum of $10 to aid the fugitive slaves in Canada. They're talking about a person who had recently escaped from slavery, was in a destitute condition. Voted for a committee of 5 be appointed for purpose of providing her with comfortable clothing, and the committee be a standing committee whose duty it is to attend to cases of those fugitive slaves who may in future present them and make such provision for their wants. So these networks begin to form. We know Sarah and Mary Harris were working, and Sarah would set up a station in Kingston, Rhode Island. These were two sisters that attended Prudence Crandall's school in Connecticut, and the school was attacked. The windows were broken, it was set on fire. They would take waste and put it on their doorsteps. They tried to take it to town meeting. They would not let the headmistress speak in town meeting because she was a woman. A couple of abolitionists, including Samuel May, remember him? He's here, he's there, he's everywhere. He was down here and tried to speak for them, but they would not allow them to speak for her either. So her school closed after 3 years, but we see her students becoming involved in the abolition cause and running stations. The American Anti-Slavery Society, we see a lot of these folks become connected with the Underground Railroad. They are separate things, but we see those connections between the two. We had freedom riders in 1841, and Massachusetts had 8 railroads. 3 of them were not integrated. And so these 3 gentlemen traveled together and spent a lot of time being thrown off of trains. One of the trains, Frederick Douglas, got onto the seat. They tried to take him off, and he was a big man and wrapped himself around the carriage pretty tightly, and they took the seats out with him. So we see this going on. They had connections to the Liberator newspaper, and the yellow part, those were editorial comments as far as whether lines were integrated or not, and along with the train schedules. So there's little comments there that the one has equality of privilege and one definitely does not. The comments were not nice. So we know from as early as 1780, we see enslaved people from New York on the William Buffum farm, 1833, we see a woman named Susan who had escaped, wanted to know if she should go to Worcester or maybe to New Bedford, but she wanted to learn how to read. 1838, we see a woman named Nancy Adams, and I'm going to talk about a little bit more. And then 1848, we start to see things get a little bit worse. We're coming up on the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, and it was becoming very rough, even here in New England, to live openly. And so we know a man was in Uxbridge, but we don't know his name because that was not shared. So in 1850, Congress passes the Fugitive Slave Act. And a lot of it is because of Massachusetts. Massachusetts and many free states had personal liberty laws. And juries often refused to convict when slaveholders would go to these juries and ask for things. So Congress changed the law. So if you were a person that a slaveholder was looking for or said they were looking for, all they had to do was point at you, sign an affidavit, and leave the area. They didn't have to take it before a judge. They didn't have to show any ownership. They just had to kind of point and sign, and you were out. So this is the beginning of vigilance committees. And we see the Boston Vigilance Committee, which was a unifying force for things like the black churches, other societies and churches, the Prince Hall Freemasons, attorneys, politicians, male and female anti-slavery societies, other free people of color, and the freedom seekers themselves. This is when New England became very organized in how it was responding to all of this. And we see these vigilance committees in other cities, all the way to Canada. So the vigilance committees, Robert Morris was an attorney. He was involved in many of the actions that the vigilance committees took. But he said, let us be bold. If any man flies from slavery and comes among us, when he's reached us, we'll say he's gone far enough. If any man comes here to New Bedford and they try to take him away, you telegraph to us in Boston, and we'll come down 300 strong and stay with you, and we won't go until he's safe. And that was not an exaggeration. They can and did do this. We see runaway ads starting to build. Runaway ads are the ads that slaveholders would put in newspapers, and we see a huge jump in that from the 1830s. This is partly when Alabama and Mississippi began opening up to cotton, so they had cleared Indians and pushed them into Oklahoma and began planting cotton in the South. And so we start seeing a huge amount of traffic happen on the Underground Railroad, and then the runaway ads supporting that. We see people arriving. The first one that we have documented is Eliza Small and Polly Ann Bates. They arrived in Boston on a ship. They had escaped enslavement. And a Baltimore police officer came aboard the ship and said, those are fugitives, you have to hold them. The captain held them there, but they were offended by a Boston attorney, Samuel Sewell. So they went to court, and the court noted that a ship was not actually a prison and the captain had no right to hold them. And so in that moment, the attorneys told them to basically run. But they had brought a large group of white and black women who surrounded these two women, escorted them out of the courthouse into a carriage, and sent them on to Canada. And this type of thing happened over and over and over again in Boston. Not always successfully, but we start to see these kind of actions with the vigilance committees. So the vigilance committees, these are some of the people who are involved with them. They kept extensive records, so we actually know quite a lot of their activities. These are some of the people that kept a full list of the people that they helped. We also know the places where these people were. So we see people in Hopedale, we see people in Southborough, Worcester, Attleboro, Providence, New Bedford, all over the place. And I'm just going to go back one for a sec here. We also know a large part of these families were families traveling with children. 38% of the record are families traveling with children. So these are some of the more famous cases of the vigilance committees in Massachusetts. So you're seeing some of these coming out in books now. William Craft and his wife Ellen, there's some recent books that have come out on this. Rebecca Latimer and her husband George, Shadrach Minkins, who was taken to Canada. And then we have Anthony Burns. And at this point, the President of the United States was getting tired of Massachusetts and sent up the Marines who surrounded Anthony Burns and put him on a ship back to Georgia. And so he was taken back into enslavement. Eventually word returned to Massachusetts that he was not free, and they found out where he was, and a minister from up here, Minister Grimes, went down and bought his freedom, and they got him out of there again, but it took a while. So they were not always successful, and the government definitely was not always supportive. So again, these are some of the locations. The house in the middle is the Lewis and Harriet Hayden House, which still exists in Boston. It's a private residence. It's not open to the public. And these are some of the descendants of Provided and her brother, David Southwick, so you have the Southwick family that we're looking at. So the women in blue, these are Quaker women who had education and they became teachers and leaders. And if you look over at the left, you'll see Abby Kelley Foster in this group of people, and a whole lot of Buffums. You see all the Buffums? There are so many Buffums. So we see as well going on with education. We see people becoming members of the Underground Railroad. We see people becoming members of the Abolition Society. And this group of people are incredibly active, and we know from their personal histories that there was a large amount of understanding, and the Quaker community was probably one of the first English communities to ban enslavement among its own members. That was very, very early on. So this is the first map that was made of the Underground Railroad. This was created in the 30s by William Siebert. You can see some of the different routes where this was going on. There is more information from there. This house here still exists. This is in North Smithfield. This is the William Buffum house. So the grandfather of this family of Buffums, this is where his farm was and where he helped somebody in 1780. This here is the Uxbridge Friends Meeting House. And William Buffum, the same William Buffum, was one of the people who constructed this meeting house. You'll notice at the top that the bricks are a slightly different color than they are at the bottom. That was because they had to stop construction for the Revolutionary War. So that little marker is where the Revolutionary War occurred. So we see the Buffums building this meeting house. This is in Uxbridge. This is the meeting house where Abby Kelley Foster attended as a girl. So this is where her family attended, as well as all of the Buffums. So they knew each other quite well. So Abby Kelley Foster, again, she was born in 1811 in Pelham. She was a Quaker. She was the daughter of Diana Daniels and Wing Kelley. Remember the Kellys from Cape Cod? That's her family. She would attend the Moses Brown School, and she would become one of the leading people, not only in the Underground Railroad and the abolition movements, but in the women's rights movement. She became a public speaker at a time that was not done. It was not a thing that women did. So she would speak at the 1837, 1838 inter-slavery conferences. She would travel the nation speaking against slavery, and she would become a leader in the women's rights movement. So we see her all over the place. Margaret Fuller was a friend of Abby Kelley Foster's, Margaret Fuller the intellectual, and she wrote about her in a very personal way. So we have a little bit of a window on her character. And she says, I think she did much good, more than the men in her place could do. Men speak through and mostly from intellect, and this addresses itself in others, which is what it creates and is combative. Not easily shall we find elsewhere or before this time any written observations on the same subject, so delicate and profound. She acted like a gentle hero with her mild decision and womanly calmness. All heroism is mild and quiet and gentle, for it is life and possession. And combativeness and firmness show a want of actualness. She is as earnest, fresh, and simple as when she first entered the crusade. So it's a very interesting observation because she was tough as nails. She absolutely was. What this woman did was extraordinary. But she also remained kind of true to her Quaker beginnings. She would eventually leave the Quakers because they didn't fully agree with the fervor of her abolition support. But we do see her out there. In Uxbridge, we also see a man named Effingham Capron. Early Quakers would not get portraits made. They would get silhouettes. They considered portraits to be ostentatious. And so that is an actual silhouette of Effingham Capron, who was running the station in Uxbridge. Charles Lennox Reman, who we've seen before, would note with Capron at his funeral that he was one of the few who never looked over their shoulder to see who were scoffing when he asked a colored man into his house. And that was very high praise. So the Buffum sisters, we have Buffum, 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 Buffum. They were really extraordinary with the ladies. So if you get a chance to read some of the writings of the Buffum sisters, I would definitely recommend that. We see Samuel May in Leicester. This is the Abby Kelley's Liberty Farm, which is in Worcester, Massachusetts. And then we see the Samuel May House, which is in Leicester, Massachusetts. Both buildings are still standing. The Samuel May House is on the old Becker campus out in Leicester. So Margaret Fuller would write, if the Negro be a soul, if a woman be a soul apparelled in flesh, to one master only are they accountable. But there's one law for all souls, and if there is to be an interpreter of it, he comes not as a man or a son of man, but as a son of God. It is not in vain that the verbal statement has been made, all men are born free and equal. There it stands, a golden certainty wherewith to encourage the good, to shame the bad. The new world may be called clearly to perceive that it incurs the utmost penalty if it rejects the sorrowful brother, and if men are deaf, the angels hear. So these are some of the places on the Blackstone Valley route of the Underground Railroad. So you can see some of these places that we've looked at. That's Effingham Capron's house in Uxbridge, this one that we're on right now. It no longer stands, unfortunately, although the mill that he and his father built do. So we see these various houses. Robert Adams was an amazing guy. He was one of the conductors, and we'll see a little bit more of him as we go along. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time on one particular person. This is Mrs. Nancy Adams. This is her grave site, which is located in Uxbridge, Massachusetts. And this is the site that we sought recognition from the National Park Service for, because we have an extraordinary amount of information on the life of this particular woman. So in 1840, we know that she was in Uxbridge. She had escaped enslavement. She would participate in an anti-slavery conference. She donated 25 cents. We know in 1846 that she sent a basket of cakes to William Lloyd Garrison, the founder of the anti-slavery movement. And the reason we know that is in his newspaper, he published a thank you letter. So we have a little thank you letter for the basket of cakes, plus, you know, a quote of the letter that she sent him. She could not read or write, but she would get letters written for her by various people. Excuse me for just a sec. Thank you, Francis. Appreciate that. I'm getting excited. I had to take my sweater off. Okay. All right. So in census records, we see her in Uxbridge in 1850 and 1855. She will live there for many years. She dies an elderly woman. Her death record says she was 100 years old. She was probably close to that, but she didn't know how old she was, and neither did anybody else, really. But she was quite elderly. An ornate headstone was found at her grave, but it's the only headstone bearing a name in that particular cemetery, which is the Uxbridge Almshouse Cemetery. Now, there was a problem. That little drawing that you're seeing, those are the plans for Route 146 that connects Providence and Worcester. And those plans originally went right over the top of this cemetery. And so there was contact made to Boston University, and they actually sent out an archaeological team, and they documented and lifted the remains from this entire cemetery. About 32 people who were there. She's listed as number 8 on this particular map, kind of in the center. This is her headstone, the original that was lifted up. It was found face down in the dirt. We don't know who had this carved for her, but it's much different than anything else that's there. This was the drawing they made of her grave at that particular cemetery. They did also take a picture for documentation as the graves were opened. We know that she had medical issues. She had a mushroom deformity in her hip. They believe that she was probably a very tall woman, probably 5'8". Her height was shortened by this injury, and they believe she probably had trouble walking, walked with a cane. The records say that she was a very elderly person and had a very hard life. At the time the remains in the study were done, there was no law for reburial of remains like this, so they had special legislation passed, and remains remained at Boston University for 10 years. When the special legislation came through, they held a ceremony of reburial, and the people in this particular photo are descendants of Civil War veterans who participated in the memorial. So this is the new Almshouse Cemetery, where the 31 of the 32 graves were repatriated. We see that one of the graves was identified as Nipmuc, and that person was returned and repatriated to the Nipmucs. So the old headstone was damaged quite badly, so at the graveyard itself, a new headstone was carved and dedicated there. There was another person who was possibly Nipmuc, so Chief Wiseau of the Nipmucs did attend the reburial service there. And then in 2017, something absolutely extraordinary occurred, which is in the Clement Library in Michigan. They found a letter from Mrs. Nancy Adams. So we actually have an account of her life in her own words. So it says, "My dear friends, I received your very acceptable letter requesting me to give an account of my life, which I shall do as far as I am able. I was born in the eastern part of Maryland, and I was married when I was about 17. About 3 years after that, my master was going to sell us to the Spaniards, but our mistress, to whom we belonged, did not want us to go, and told us to go away somewhere and stay until he got over the fit of selling us. And we went. I and my husband and 2 children lived in the woods 5 months with no food but acorns and no shelter but a large tree which had been blown up by the roots, which we cut out with our own hands. Our master had now given us up for dead and said that he would let anyone that could find us have us for so much. As he thought the chance was small, he sold us for a small sum. But one man, named Jesse Waters, paid him the money for us. When my mistress said that we should be servants to no one unless we could be set at liberty when we had earned enough to pay the sum, which this man promised to do, and said he would give us a log house and 5 acres of land in 2 years. My boy was to stay with him until he was 22, and my girl until she was 18, and if we had any children while we were there, they should be free. He found us in the woods and told us about it, and we were rejoiced to think that we should now have a home and a good master and soon should be free. He was very kind to us during the time we stayed with him. As we had left all our things behind and had nothing to furnish our house, we worked nights for the neighbors and so got considerable money and bought some things. But our master was not what we had thought of him, as we were soon to find. About this time, he went a journey several miles from home, and while he was gone, he sold us to the Negro traders without our knowing it. When he came home, he told my husband to take the team and go to Georgetown and get some goods for him. He went, and I have never seen him since. The same night, the men came and bound me and my children with ropes and put us into a wagon, broke open our chest, and took what money was there, which amounted to about $72, and divided it amongst themselves, without giving me any part of it, then carried us to Newmarket. When we got there, we saw a great many colored people all in chains. Several of the women had no clothes on. We stayed in that place 2 or 3 weeks, and were then taken away in the night and carried on board a vessel and put down in the hold where we stayed 3 days, and then stopped a short time but soon sailed again to Baltimore, where we were put into a market house where we stayed about 2 weeks. Then we started from there in a lumber wagon and traveled until we came to the Ohio, where we took a red boat and changed from one boat to another until we came to Port Gibson. Port Gibson is in Mississippi. It was very slow traveling. My children were sick with the fever, and we saw many dead bodies along the way. When we came there, a gentleman came riding along by the water, came in among us, and he said, "What can you do?" Said I can talk and eat and sleep, so that's what I've been used to. "Well," said he, "you are the very one I want." And he took me and my 2 boys, I had buried my little girl on the Mississippi, and sent us out into the country with the man who came with us. 2 or 3 days after, he sent for us to come to his house, and we went. He gave us to his oldest child, a small boy. He then sent me into the field to pick cotton. The first year I was not whipped at all, but after that I was treated as bad as possible and lived. My allowance of food for myself and 2 children was 2 quarts of meal and 2 pounds of pork a week. And for clothing, I had no gown in the summer and only a short one in the winter. They have 2 in a year. The women were obliged to work, as were the men, in all kinds of business and at all times of the year. There were several different overseers on the plantation, each of whom had $1,000 a year. Over time, my son, who was then about 19 years old, went with my master's son in a boat on the river, and they were afraid that he was practicing to run away. So he was taken and received 400 lashes, after which he was salted and peppered. And there is a second letter that relates to her that indicates that she was the person made to salt and pepper the son. I stayed there about 3 years when, being in feeble health, I hired myself out to a man who came north and came to Norwich, where I got away and hid in an ice house, where I stayed 2 days until he left the place. I remained in Norwich 12 years. When hearing that my master was coming after me, I came to this place, where I have remained ever since. I have thus far tried to give some account of myself, but I have not told half that I could tell. My eyes have seen what my tongue dares not speak. My health is now very poor, has been through the winter, and I think I shall hardly get up again. What I have told is the truth, and nothing but the truth. I am much obliged to you for your present, and shall keep it to look at for your sakes, for I never expect to wear it out. With many wishes for your welfare and happiness, I remain your friend, Nancy Adams. Again, this is the sort of thing we don't get hardly at all, a personal account like this, where we can understand what her life was like. So I want to show you a couple of locations very quickly. So this is a map of her route down to Mississippi and Louisiana. These are the plantations in Louisiana at that time, so she was likely on one of these. She was there for quite a long time. She said she was enslaved for 40 years. This is her gravesite in Uxbridge at the New Almshouse Cemetery. And this is the logo of the National Underground Network for Freedom. So we got in touch with them and presented this information, and they accepted that as evidence that she was on the Underground Railroad, and she's become part of what's sort of a virtual national park. They're keeping a database of all of these sites. They have 700 now that they've documented to kind of protect them and keep them within the National Park Service. So this is a map where the stars are. These are places that are under that national park protection here in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, a little bit in Connecticut. This is her original headstone. The original headstone is not out of the gravesite because it was damaged, and this year we built an archival case for it, which resides at our library now. We built it low because we have children who get this same presentation. In fact, it was my joy to do this last Friday for our 5th graders, slightly edited. But we do that with them. And this is the exhibit that we created, which is at Riverbend Farm. Riverbend Farm is undergoing renovations right now, so it's not available. You might notice the opening date on this exhibit. Can you see that? Mm-hmm. February 1st, 2020. Yep. That was a good time to open, wasn't it? So it was open for a month, and our original intention was to take it to other public venues, and it sat locked up during COVID. So then it reopened after COVID. They may be moving this to another location in the state park system, but I haven't heard yet where it's going to end up. So, but this is the exhibit when it opened. We actually talked to our cultural council and got some money for printing so we could get this put together. Based on that, we went to the schools and we did a contest with them. We asked them to make pictures related to this, and the teachers put together units about this. We gave away prizes, so we gave them North Stars for the winners of this little contest. And then we had the National Park Service involved. They've been very helpful in providing that. So that's the case itself. And you can see in the front, we put the Sankofa symbol on the front of her case so that it is remembered who this woman is and what her story is. There's also a little bit of explanatory material that we keep close by so people can understand why this is special and why it's important. So, do you have any questions?
Thank you. Come to the front. I'll turn the lights on.
Thank you. Appreciate that. I think you have one back here. Yes.
What were the towns between Uxbridge and Worcester, and were there any stops in any of those towns?
We're sure there were stops. It's hard to find everything because, again, everyone was breaking the law. And most of the stuff that's been put together has been put together either from letters or personal records and that sort of thing. But we're pretty sure between New Bedford and Worcester, there were stops all along there because people couldn't travel more than 15 or 20 miles in a day if they were going fast. So there had to be stops quite a long way. In Uxbridge, we're aware of 3 stops. I know of one in Douglas, which is just across the border from Uxbridge. And then we have another couple in North Smithfield and Valley Falls, Fall River, down that way.
But you think between Uxbridge and Worcester was a one-day travel,
sure there
or
more. Yeah.
there might have been other stops
I'm
as
sure
well?
there are more.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Yes. Other questions?
Do you have any idea of how many people ended up in Canada versus staying in the United States?
Samuel May, he's here, he's there, he's everywhere, also went to Canada and kept track of these things. And he believes that at least through New England, 20,000 people ended up in Canada.
Wow.
Yeah. So a lot.
So the National Park Service has recognized several places. How do we search for those? Do they have an online database?
If you search for the Network to Freedom on the National Park website, they have a map and database. And if you click on the locations, it'll give you a little brief of which each site is and where it is. Yeah.
You had a slide that said there were meetings of abolitionists in Northborough and Southborough. Any in Westborough, and any evidence of stops?
I believe there was one in Westborough. You have to look through the Liberator, and I've looked through hundreds of these, and I do think I've seen Westborough, but I don't recall off the top of my head when and where. I'd be happy to look it up and send it to your director if you want me to do
Any
that.
houses in Westborough associated?
I don't know that. That's not my area of expertise, but I think that is something that local historians should spend some time on.
So, Bill, I think that there's a house on Belknap that was on, and also the house on 135, like the last house on the right, like over where you have the cutoff to Davis, the red house. I think that also was a stop.
Yeah.
Again, the abolitionists are just pointers, and I want to be clear, the majority of people who were supporting people on the Underground Railroad were black, not white. We know more about the white people because they had less at risk, and there's more records around it. But we know that most of the stops were actually black folk in town. So you can use the abolitionists to point at a town, and then you need to kind of go through specific records and find out where people were living. Yes?
How did you become interested in this whole story?
I was on the Uxbridge Board of Selectmen, and one of our town historians came to me and told me about this program. And he said, I think we should apply for it. And like, I didn't know a whole lot about it at the time, so I said, well, tell me more. And so he told me more, and I made a call to DC and found the person we needed to talk to. And I said, I think we have something here. And so we sent an application off, and they sent it back, and we sent it down, and we sent it back, as you do with these things. And then eventually they said yes. So that's how I became involved. And then since then, I've become an amateur historian. I don't want to, claim the PhD on it because I don't have that. My area is a different area. But I have become a student at this and continue some of that research. So.
Very nice, thank you.
I just want to say thank you for the Black history of the early Massachusetts colonies. I mean, what you read in history books is that the black people who escaped this far came here and lived wonderful lives alongside the white people, and everything was hunky-dory, and so we should be really proud of ourselves for outlawing slavery here. But
it's something I've heard more than once as I presented, the folks who were actually shocked to find out that slavery had existed in New England, in fact, probably started in this area in New England.
And that there was so much discrimination against the black people when they did get here.
Absolutely. Like I said, enslavement ended, but social equality did not. That social inequality did not end at that time. So, yes.
I have a question. We've had a presentation by the Hassanamisco Nipmuc chief, and she has done a lot of research on the marriages between the Nipmucs and the blacks.
Mm-hmm.
So, can you comment on that at all?
It was common at that time. Basically, with social inequality as it was, if you were any percentage non-white, your marriage choices were now constrained. And so we do see in this area a lot of non-whites marrying other non-whites and a lot of whites, but sometimes it wasn't always as clear-cut as you might think. And there were some people who were passing, and there were some people who got quiet about their history, and people who just didn't know and didn't care. So when you start seeing the genetic studies that we're seeing, well, the American history is pretty complicated.
Yeah.
You don't want to make a lot of assumptions.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So if you were a Quaker and you were making a fuss, they could take you and sell you?
Yeah, they could take you, put it on a ship, and sell you off.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wasn't it illegal back then for non-whites to marry whites? I'm thinking of the Love case.
It varied from state to state, and I don't know the law in Massachusetts. I think there were anti-miscegenation laws, but they weren't in the earliest part of the colonies. But the social pressure was such that it was kind of happening anyway, even if the law hadn't caught up yet. But Massachusetts did pass anti-miscegenation laws, but I think it was a little bit later. So. Yes?
Mine's not a question, but it's really actually a compliment on the breadth of knowledge that you've amassed, and coupled with your ability to explain it clearly and logically.
Oh, thank
It
you.
was really a fabulous presentation.
That's really kind. Thank you so much. I'd like to go out on that note, but any more? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, that was incredibly well researched, and thank you. I just want to mention our next event is going to be on Monday, March 4th at 7:30 p.m. at the Willows. It's going to be something completely different. It's a program of classical ballet and music from southern India. We have a large Indian population. So that's going to be with Ajay Firumali, who's artistic director of the Natyamani School of Dance, and she's going to exhibit a dance form that originated 2,000 years ago in Hindu temples. And this will help us learn more about the culture and art forms of our Indian residents. And we hope you'll consider joining us then. Thank you. Thank you for a fabulous presentation.